Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Il, it's great to be with you again. I'm terribly sorry I can't be there with you in person, but I would like to say a warm word of congratulations on your 30th anniversary. The Institute for Global Economics is an important institution, not only in Korea, but in the world. And these institutions are absolutely essential in a period of a certain amount of chaos and turmoil in the global economy. And we're very grateful for the work that you've done, for the important ideas that have come out of IGE and all the meetings and things you've organized over the 30 years of your history. So again, warm congratulations. You have a number of friends and colleagues of yours and mine who are going to be speaking about the global order or disorder in various dimensions. I thought I would spend some of my time this morning talking about our rather sudden change in economic circumstances in the global economy, and then talk a little bit about the global transformations that are underway. So, I mean, as everybody knows, global growth has been slowing down. There's a major fight on the inflation front, at least in the developed countries in North America and Europe. And there's a war in Ukraine. So let me try to put some sort of parameters around this. I believe we have shifted really quite rapidly from a long period of what I call demand-constrained growth. That is, the supply side of the global economy was a relatively small source of constraints on global growth. We had a massive amount of productive capacity introduced into the global economy as the countries that are now the major emerging economies grew and expanded their footprint in the global economy. But that period was very unusual. We had deflationary forces all over the place. You can see them in price indices that I and others have talked about and published about. That period ended, and then in addition, we are living in a world of increasing shocks. They're not. Some of them are coming from geopolitical tensions, and others are coming from sources like the pandemic, like climate change, and so on. And so we have a pattern of diversification of economic activity and especially supply chains going on in the global economy. We lived for a long period of time in which global supply chains were constructed basically on considerations having to do with efficiency and comparative advantage. That it's not that those things are completely irrelevant now. They're still, important forces affecting the architecture of the global economy, but there are other forces that have to do with resilience, risk, and so on, that are responses to these increasing shocks from multiple sources. So I think the simple thing to say is that makes the global economy more expensive and constrains the supply side, at least in major transitions. For those who kind of wonder what, this is, the specific example that we feel here in Europe is a very high speed diversification away from dependence on Russian oil and gas, Russian fossil fuels. And then when you add to that a pattern of stunningly rapid decline in productivity growth in the last decade, in all the data that I've seen, and it's not just a macroeconomic phenomenon. You look across sectors in the economy, what you find is that in the vast majority of sectors, there was a significant slowdown, even in ones that had high productivity growth rates going in, things like finance, the tech sectors, and so on. And we have big changes in labor market behavior in the American economy, which is doing moderately well under these conditions. We have labor shortages pretty much everywhere, but not just in high skilled areas. We have labor shortages in the big employment sectors like government, like healthcare, hospitality, retail, construction. It goes on and on. And people have very different preferences. there are lots of people who want to avoid working in environments that are either stressful or unsafe or inflexible in the sense of working from home. And so these are major, major changes in the kind of behavior of the supply side of the economy. And then when you add to that the fact that about over 75% of the world's GDP is produced in countries that are aging very rapidly. Some of them even have declining labor forces, so that they only account for a third of the world's population. So you might say, well, the other 2/3 can sort of fill in the gap, and that may happen at some point. But right now, they're not configured in such a way as to connect to the global economy and produce a big surge in productivity. And then you overlay all this with the geopolitical tensions and the constraints that are being imposed on them, and the economic shock of the Ukraine war, and you have a pattern of constraints of varying degrees of duration on the global economy. These produce a significant mismatch between supply and demand because of the inelasticity of the supply side, and they're the ultimate underlying source of the inflationary pressures that we're dealing with, because they won't subside fast enough, notwithstanding the early expectations of the major central banks. To the contrary, the only option to prevent the inflationary pressures from turning into embedded expectations and inflation taking on a life of its own is basically to hack down the demand side, which is what the central banks are busy doing. And they have a very difficult challenge. They're late to the game. The interest rate rises and declines in their balance sheets have been reasonably quick. I mean, we haven't seen this kind of thing before for 2 or 3 decades, 3 decades to be precise. No, 4, actually, the early 1980s. And so one side effect of that is a certain amount of turbulence. We're living in a world in which the financial system and other parts of the global economy were configured on basically on the basis of a long period of no inflation and a more recent period of very low interest rates. And when those things change rapidly, there's all kinds of pockets of stress and distress. We saw that recently in the United States in the regional banks, which looked like they might be destabilized. But their the balance sheets assets, the long duration ones, were declining in value. And the depositors who used to be sticky started to behave in a different way once there were alternatives that had reasonable rates of return to go to, like short and medium term government bonds. So it's a very, very sort of interestingly difficult and chaotic period. If I had to look out into the future, it's difficult to forecast in this kind of environment, but it looks to me, first, I would say when you add all this up, this is regime change in the global economy. This is not in terms of parameters and behavior and the mindsets that are required to deal with it, whether you're in business or finance or in government or the central banks. You need to see this in a different way. It's just not business as usual. I think the short term is a difficult period. I don't see many growth engines working very fast. I mean, obviously, there are big differences when you move across countries. India is a country at that stage of growth that has very high growth potential, and there's a number of things going on, including an impressive digital revolution that may produce results that are like that. China's recovery is, pretty impressive, although there are major, hurdles to overcome on the Chinese side, but they're different growth numbers than you see in other parts of the world. Some of that's just normal, the difference between middle, low, and high income countries. After that, I think there's considerable uncertainty for reasons I'll come to in a minute, having to do with global transformations. But before I get there, let me just make one other comment. Despite all this chaos, we have a considerable amount of embedded resilience in most of the global economy. What 30 or 40 years ago was a set of countries that did not have, big balance sheets, did not have a whole lot of fiscal capacity, have become middle-income countries. They withstood the pandemic that we just went through reasonably well. And so I would say the vast majority of countries and even people in the world live in economies that are positioned in such a way that they're able to withstand the kinds of shocks that we're seeing. Now, there's no question there's been a run up in debt in the global economy with a big boost in debt levels, gross debt levels, as a result of the pandemic. And that's particularly obvious in sovereign debt. I mean, I've seen figures that suggest that globally, sovereign debt is now in excess of global GDP, which hasn't happened in a very, very long time. I mean, there are countries that are exceptions. Japan has obviously been an outlier for a long time, but I mean, globally, this is a high debt operation with less capacity than it had before. It's another element of fragility. But so the two other comments are, I think that the low-income countries are a matter of considerable concern. They have the normal problems of difficult demographics, governance issues, and just the general, hard part of jumpstarting growth in the early stages of developing country growth. But in addition, they now have a huge shock delivered by the pandemic, both medically and in economic terms. On the fiscal side, there's a considerable amount of debt distress in that area that is not being addressed in a coherent fashion by the international financial system, in part because the creditors are now such a diverse group. It's harder than it used to be to get them together to kind of do something that is vigorous and coherent. And finally, even though I'm going to leave it to my colleagues to talk mostly about this, I think that I don't see any sign. The way I put it in a recent article, and this has to do with the way the global order is put together, I think there's almost no chance that we can return to a version of the multilateral system that we had before. There are too many intrusions, barriers, and so on. Both the United States and China seem to have decided that the only way to play this game is to play it as a non-cooperative game. I hasten to add, non-cooperative does not mean zero-sum, although there may be zero-sum aspects to it in the area of national security and so on. But nevertheless, in areas where there are significant benefits to not sort of lapsing into just playing playing the game in a non-cooperative fashion, such as climate change, agreeing on the parameters of the way we're going to interact in the digital world, and a whole lot of other things, dealing with pandemics. We're just not going in the right direction, and it's hard to see anything that would produce a sort of change in that behavior. I mean, you pretty much every morning, including this morning for me, you get up and discover, sort of more steps that are in the category of sort of trade frictions and restrictions. I should note, however, that a very large part of the global economy, including virtually all the emerging economies, are vocally resistant to going down the path of, flat out strategic competition between the major players, the US and China primarily, but also to some extent Europe. They have not signed up for the most part to the sanctions against Russia, and they've in many ways, adopted a kind of non-aligned status, which is perfectly understandable. I mean, they have important economic interests in being connected, both to China and to the West. And so, right now we're kind of in the middle of a muddle, as I would say. But in that context, I can imagine reconstructing a version of multilateralism that makes some sense, but it's going to be a more complicated version than what we've had before. There are too many interests and strategic reasons for having, modifications, fragmentation of a variety of kinds. I don't see the restrictions on certain kinds of technology and products that embody them, especially in the digital area, being removed anytime soon. In part because of the overlap between the sort of economic interests on the one hand and national security and defense related issues and interests on the other, which are really quite different. Now we can do a better or worse job of sort of trying to prevent those kinds of restrictions from spilling over and adversely affecting the entire global economy. But it's going to take a level of determined cooperation that thus far we haven't seen. I think there are real risks associated with the aggressive use of economic and financial policies under the heading, think of it as sanctions, to the global economy. And I do think there is a concerted effort in certainly in Asia, but more broadly than that, to try to find alternatives that reduce the power that the United States is wielding, using the dominance of the dollar in the global financial system. The problem with trying to get rid of the dollar is there aren't very many good alternatives when you look at, what's required to have a reserve currency. But I don't have any doubt that these efforts will continue, that there'll be more trade settlement in other currencies, including the renminbi. And besides, they're more efficient than settling trade in a third currency. So that I think will go on, and the dollar's dominance won't go away very fast, but it will diminish over time, and that's part of the declining, dominance, economic dominance of the United States and the West in the global economy. So it's not a pretty picture in the short run. I think there will be significant attempts to encourage leaders to take us in a different direction. The domestic politics, at least on the American side, are not particularly helpful in that respect. People have noted many times that aggressive approaches to China are pretty much bipartisan area of agreement in a country where there's very little bipartisan agreement on anything. So it's hard to see that changes direction. Although I will say, the Biden administration looks like it is trying to segregate to some extent the sort of strategic moves against China in things like semiconductors and the equipment that's needed to make them from sort of the general policies. Thus far, I don't think, while they haven't removed, significantly some of the tariffs that were put in place by the Trump administration, they haven't really moved aggressively to play the game in a zero-sum fashion, and in part because it would hurt the United States and everybody else in the trading system. I mean, there is some good news. The return of China after the zero COVID period will be a big boost, I think, provided they don't have some kind of accident on the way through. And so the short run looks pretty tough. Let me just conclude my remarks by saying, that there is a different way to look at the world, and it's not that it's, inconsistent. It just it comes on a longer time horizon. Then the way I think of it is that there are at least three major transformations underway in the global economy. One is a digital one. We got used to it and sort of talked about it, but nobody really paid much attention. They're really paying attention now. These generative AI models, which most people think of as GDP, not GDP, GPT, are really stunningly powerful. And I have no doubt that in the knowledge part of all of our economies, over time, they will produce just an enormous productivity surge. And like all really powerful technologies, there'll be lots of issues having to do with downside risks, misuse of the technology, unpredictable or unanticipated consequences, and so on. And so it's not necessarily going to be a smooth journey. And there'll be lots of jobs that change, at least parts of those jobs. but somewhere down the road, a very large fraction of the workforce in what used to be called the knowledge economy, it's the technologists call it the bits part, meaning bits as opposed to atoms, are going to have really powerful digital assistants, multiple digital assistants to get their work done. I mean, these Chat GDP, and by the way, these folks, the Googles and the Microsoft OpenAI have not released the most powerful versions of this, in part because they don't really know exactly what they'll do if they do release them. But they're pretty good at writing software, at least the first draft of it. That's a pretty labor-intensive process. I mean, even if it was just confined to that, and it certainly isn't, it's powerful. So it's the digital revolution, has been ongoing for a long time, but it doesn't look like it's anywhere near the end, and it's gotten people's attention pretty much everywhere in the world. There's another one, a quieter one, but it's pretty important, and that is a revolution in biomedical and life sciences, which has implications not only for healthcare and drug development and vaccines, but for agriculture, and food resilience and so on. These are and there's just stunning achievements in that area, some of which overlap with the digital revolution. For those who are interested, you might be interested in finding out what this major AI research center in London called DeepMind, which is part of Google, did with discovering the three-dimensional structure of proteins. Essentially, they basically used an AI type system to predict the three-dimensional structure of proteins from the amino acid sequence. And not only did they succeed and make pretty accurate predictions, but they did this on all 200 million known proteins in the world and published it so that it's open source. Anybody in the world could just look that up. And it's not only open source, free. So there's stunning achievements like that coming down the road at an accelerating pace. And then, of course, the third one, which is more mixed in terms of its economic impact, is a huge, major energy transition in pursuit of sustainable patterns of growth globally. All of these things, I think, create to some extent create counterforces, real opportunities to reverse the productivity, patterns that we've seen in the recent past, to restart growth in a supply constrained world. The two things that would be the most helpful are, one, bringing more people into the labor force, whether they live in Africa, or the Middle East and so on. And the other one is a big surge in productivity to help close the gap and increase the elasticity of the supply side of the global economy. So on that front, which is, I think of as a kind of 5 to 10 year time horizon, I'm rather more optimistic. I don't think they take care of the geopolitical tensions and the damage that can be done if they get out of hand. But I do think they're in the right hands. They're at least have the potential to produce a much less gloomy looking forward outlook for the global economy than what we've seen what we've experienced as we went through the pandemic and then so on. One very striking thing that you've probably noticed at the Institute is just a global explosion of entrepreneurial activity all over the world. So on every continent, there wasn't that long ago that we could find, the centers of, major innovation in a small number of countries, and a small number of communities within those countries. In the United States, there was a small number in Korea. You had some of them. China is now a major player. India is a major player. There are lots of them in Latin America. It's become a kind of global phenomenon. And I think once it takes hold and continues, it will be another powerful contributor to reversing the sort of negative features of the global picture that I've painted in the short run. So I hope that at least some of that's of interest, and I'll look forward to hearing the results of the conference when you meet and then ponder these issues.